Good evening, and welcome back to the Pastor Study. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 7, Jesus speaks to his disciples, and he says, "You have but to ask, and you shall receive. Seek, and you shall find. And if you'll knock, the door will be opened unto you." Wonderful verse. Claimed it many times myself, as have other believers. But I've also heard other believers say, and I've thought it myself, well, I've asked, and I haven't received what I've asked for. What gives here, God? We could go a bit on the commercial side of things and say I'm still waiting for my 2023 Lightning F-150 pickup to show up, or my new Cadillac. I mean, you get the idea, and that certainly was not what Jesus was talking about. But I do know people who have not had their prayers answered for one reason or another, and struggled in their faith because of it. Had a co-worker some years ago that had been a strong believer, and a pastor, well-known pastor of the day, had a pretty major moral failure. And my friend struggled with that, struggled with his faith, because how could this man of God fail? And he struggled. We're not the only ones who struggle with that sometimes. Jesus' first cousin was John the Baptist. Now, we know John the Baptist because his father had a miraculous vision, actually a visitation by an archangel who said that his childless wife would have a baby when he went back. She would be pregnant. They would call his name John, and he would be the forerunner of Jesus. He would be the one that Malachi prophesied would say make straight the paths, waiting for the Messiah to come. He would, in fact, even be able to baptize Jesus. John knew from the very beginning of his life, from his earliest memories, his earliest moments, teachable moments, what his goal was, what God had called him to. And it appears he sacrificed everything in his life for that. To the best of our knowledge, he was never married. He was roughly the same age Jesus was, so he was in his 30s. Lived in the wilderness much of the time, ate a very stoic diet of locusts and wild honey, not necessarily what the rest of us would want to eat. And he preached. He walked back and forth through Judea, and he preached the coming of the Messiah. Many were pierced by his words and repented of their sins. And then one day Jesus comes to him, and he recognizes him. He says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." And Jesus asks him to baptize him. And John says, "No, I mean, you should be baptizing me, Jesus." And Jesus says, "No, this is the way it needs to be." So he does. Not too much longer after that, he takes a dangerous step, and he takes after King Herod. Herod has co-opted his brother Philip's wife. So he is now living with, or perhaps has married, his sister-in-law. In either case, by Jewish law, that is illegal. And John takes him to task for it. Herod gets mad and throws John in prison. It's not too much longer that John is beginning to struggle in his faith. So he sends his disciples to Jesus and said, our master is asking, are you the one we should be waiting for, or is there somebody else? What John is really asking, I think, is, have I wasted my life? He's even probably thinking, I'm asking God to get me out of this prison. I'm still here. What gives? My faith isn't working. The relationship isn't there. I'm struggling. And so he sends them to ask Jesus this question. Jesus responds by saying, go back and tell him what you've seen. The dead come to life. The lepers are healed. The dumb speak. The blind see. The lame walk. And they go back and tell John this. Now, I think there's a deeper message hidden here that we need to see briefly this evening, beyond just the fact that even a man of the spiritual stature of John the Baptist can struggle in his faith. And I think the message or the lesson we need to learn tonight is this. Where are we looking for answers to our faith? We've all been in difficult situations, and I suspect most of us have had times where we've wondered why God didn't answer the prayers the way we wanted them answered. I think Jesus' answer to John was telling. He wasn't telling John to look at his own circumstances. He was telling John to look at the consequences of God's arrival on earth in the person of Jesus. The dead were raised, the blind were seeing, the sick were healed, etc. What Jesus was telling John is, look at what God is doing around you to build your faith. And maybe that's the answer we need to hear today as we struggle with our faith. Certainly when I'm in a difficult place, looking at the circumstances is not going to build my faith. In fact, I've been in situations where the circumstances did their very best to destroy my faith. But rather, Jesus said, look at the faith of those around you. Look at what God is doing in their lives. Look at those who are healed. Look at those whom you never believed would ever get saved. Today they're saved. I was sharing with someone recently that in my earlier years in ministry, I worked at youth camp. Worked at a number of youth camps. I was on the youth board of the Dakotas and helped manage the camps, direct the camps, a counselor in the cabins, you name it. I pretty well did it. And the funny thing is, there were kids every year that we prayed, oh God, don't let them come back, because they were our problem children. They were our headaches. And some of those kids today are some pretty phenomenal pastors. And I look at their lives and say, wow, look what God did that we couldn't do. When your faith is struggling, look around you. Look at what God is doing in other people's lives. Now, there's always a danger that we'll get angry. God, you're doing it for them and not for us. And we need to watch for that. We need to be careful that we recognize that God is doing something in our life. We're just not seeing it at the moment. That when the time comes, we will see it with perfect 20/20 hindsight, and then we'll say, oh, now I understand. But in the midst of that crisis, maybe not so much. But we can look at what God is doing in other people's lives, the way he's blessing them, the way he's healing them, the people that are getting saved, filled with God's Spirit, and use those instances to build our faith when we are in the difficult times. And when we've asked and we haven't seen it yet, going back to Matthew 7:7, it doesn't mean that God is not going to, or that he's just not answering in a way that we weren't anticipating. And you know what? He's God. And he gets to do that. So the next time your faith is struggling, instead of looking at your circumstances, look at what God is doing around you and see if that doesn't help your faith. Certainly Jesus expected that to work for John. If it worked for John in prison, it should work for us today. Have a great week. Be blessed. And I look forward to seeing you back next week, back in the Pastor Study.